as far as the season is concerned, and now you get to kind of watch the sunrise, at least yesterday morning, watch the sunrise over the Minnesota and over the Iowa cornfields. And it really is beautiful to see just the reality that when a seed goes in, that God has a cycle that takes place from a harvest perspective, and then that crop is gathered, and then the farmers actually get to rest. And I realize I've worked in a farming community before. The concept of farming and rest, somewhat of an oxymoron. Farmers don't rest that much, but at the same time, at least there is a season where they can take a breath and then prepare for the following year. I remember when I was I've done many years of pastoral ministry, and as Pastor Nathan said, I've also done a lot of higher ed, and I'll combine those in just a moment here by way of testimony. But I remember even in pastoral ministry, there were times that I would go out and I would drive through farm fields, and I would say, Lord, is there any way that I can leave pastoral ministry and just become a farmer? Because the beauty of farming is that the laws of nature suggest that you have the seed, it's very tangible, the seed goes into the ground, you cover it up with the appropriate nutrients and with the appropriate time frame, that embryo of that seed will bust open, life takes place, and then there's reproduction that takes place, and then harvest takes place. In pastoral ministry, you sow the seed and then you wait. And there isn't necessarily the tangible results from a fruit perspective. Now, you have the divine promise that as the word goes out, it will do the work. The word always does the work. But the nature of the fruit that then comes out is of a distinctly unknown response. And we know that even as we read through the context of the scriptures. I'll simply say that missions work is very similar, obviously. Missions work is the work of planting churches. It is the work of ministry. Where the seed goes out, and when the seed goes out, you don't always have the absolute divine guarantees that within a particular time frame that there will be a crop that takes place. Many times you find that your ministry is similar to that of Isaiah, which no one wants to necessarily embrace. And that ministry is you go out and you speak the word. And the reality is that God is using the word actually to harden hearts. Sometimes it is the work of moving the large rocks, and then someone will follow you and actually plow the ground. Missions is not easy, as in ministry is not easy. While at the same time, I'll simply say over the course of the last 35 years that I've had the privilege of being in ministry, I wouldn't change one day of it. Now, there are things that I would do differently, because I trust that in those 35 years I've learned a little bit. And I can look back and I can look at wisdom decisions and I go, yeah, I probably should have taken perhaps another route there or processed things in a different way. But when it comes to ministry as a whole and missions as a whole, there is no more joyful place to be. And so when I'm asked to speak at a missions conference, I do it with a huge smile on my face, because I can't think of anything better. And I can't think of anything more honorable and anything more enjoyable. And the reason I say that is actually where I'm going to start this morning. Let me give you a little bit of my own background. I didn't accept Christ. I grew up in a home where I was unbelieving. My mother was a believer. My father was not. The concept of being in any kind of ministry, it was never discussed at any level whatsoever. I ended up not finishing high school in a traditional way, I'll phrase it that way, and left home, lived on my own when I was 17. And actually was just challenged by a friend of mine to read through the Word. And specifically to read through the New Testament. And then I was to come back to this friend and say that after reading the New Testament, it had no impact on my life. And if I could say that, I was actually going to get a cash reward. And so when you're 17, 18 years old and someone offers you cash, You take it. And so all I had to do was get through Matthew to Revelation, and then cash would be flowing. I didn't make it through Matthew. And I read through Matthew one time. It's the first time I ever sat down to read the entirety of a gospel in one setting, and it captivated me. And I went back, and actually, instead of continuing my reading, I went back, started Matthew through a second time, got to Matthew 18 that talks about the 99 that are in the fold and the one that was lost. And I distinctly remember closing my Bible, setting it down, and simply saying, in my heart, I knew that I was the one that was lost, and I knew that the Good Shepherd was looking for me. And I had to make a decision. And it wasn't, in hindsight, I say it's an easy decision, but in the moment, it was anything but. And so it took 3 days for me to wrestle with not with what salvation meant, but with the recognition that if I chose Christ, then everything that was dear to me in my life, I would have to let go of it. Friends, activities, practices, habits, addictions. And that's what was tough, because those things I loved. And by God's grace, actually, it was late at night. I remember rolling out of bed, and my salvation prayer was simply, Lord, I surrender. And I'm thankful that He understood within those 2 words the recognition that I was acknowledging that I was a sinner. I was acknowledging that salvation came through Christ alone and faith alone, and that I was willing to place my wholehearted trust in Him. At that point in time, life changed. Not all my habits changed, by the way. There has been a progressive and continual growth in Christ. Certain things changed right away. Other things have been lifelong battles. But I'm thankful that, again, by grace, there's been growth in those areas. But after I accepted Christ, when people said, so what do you want to be when you grow up? My answer was, I just want to serve the Lord. And He gave everything for me. I just want to serve the Lord. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, vocational service, I didn't understand all those terms. I just understood that that's what I wanted to do. And that He owned me. And since He owned me, I actually didn't have a say. At that point in time, it wasn't a matter of just letting go and letting God, but it was a matter of pulling the anchor up, opening up the sails and saying, all right, Lord, I'm moving in the direction of service to You, and what You do with that is Your doing. All right, now we'll fast forward. From that point, God has really given the privilege of being involved in both pastoral ministry, planted 2 churches within the States here, and also have done a lot overseas. I mentioned yesterday at the men's prayer breakfast. My wife and I we've not been blessed with children. Since we've not been blessed with children, our response to that really has been, Lord, we don't want to waste our barrenness. I mean, that's something that was God's doing, and it's actually just freed us up. And so beyond pastoral ministry, and then I've been involved in higher Christian education for about the last 25 years at a Bible college level and at a seminary level. And the combination of all of those things have allowed us to visit around 70 different countries or so. And in the midst of that, really go and be an encouragement, plow fields that are unopened, and do the investigative work to see what needs to be done to get a particular country open, to go and help missionaries sustain situations where there's crises that are taking place. And then also, being in Christian Ed, you have the opportunity to rub elbows, obviously, with 18 to 25-year-olds that are still asking the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? And we don't want to play, and we never play God. And what I mean by that, it's never appropriate to look at someone and say, well, God wants you to be a missionary. That's not my role, nor is it the role of any Christian school. That's actually the role of the church. An individual can express a willingness to go serve overseas, but ultimately the church has to affirm a worthiness. The church has to say yes. This individual is manifesting the character. This individual is manifesting the gifts. We've watched them, and the church says yes. at that point in time. My role in a Christian university setting is to simply say, would you consider, as you take next steps within your life, would you consider maybe using your skills as an IT guru in an overseas setting, maybe using your skills as a nurse in an overseas setting, maybe using your skills as an educator in an overseas setting, maybe using your desire to be in pastoral ministry in an overseas setting. And so over the course of the last several years, my wife and I have taken probably 50 or 60 different short-term trips. We've taken over 2,500 college students to various countries in the world, and really, again, just expose them to what God is doing. With the idea and I don't call them mission trips anymore. I call them vision trips. Is you go with a learner's heart and you see what God is doing. And in the midst of seeing what God is doing, you give thought to, could I serve here? Lord, do you want me here? And whether that's long-term, ideally, or whether it's short-term, or ideally long-term, how can I use my gifts so that the church will continue to grow? So that's been our life. Most recently, we just came off the field. We actually did a little over a year-long stint in the country of Georgia in Western Asia, where specifically we were establishing a missionary training center where the primary focus was to train individuals who their churches had already commissioned them, their agency had already been chosen, but they were going to the hardest to reach people groups and the hardest to reach places. And so being located in Western Asia gave us access to, outside one of our windows was Russia, outside another window was Azerbaijan, Iran was just around the corner. So it gave us access to the Middle East, gave us access to North Africa, gave us access to areas within Southeast Asia where these individuals were thinking about taking the next step as far as ministry was concerned. So that's a little bit of background. The Lord has placed us now at Faith Baptist Bible College. I'll just say a word about Faith. If you ever have the opportunity to come down to Ankeny, Iowa, would love to have you there. It's a school, God is just, all I can say is God's just, his hands upon it right now. Sometimes Christian colleges and really overall Christian colleges are struggling right now. Faith has actually had over 20% increase in students over the course of the last 3 years. And so this year, every single bed is filled. If we don't, we're breaking ground for a new dormitory actually this coming week, and if we don't get that dormitory finished by next fall, then faculty members will be having students sleep in their homes. And we've already committed to that. And faculty have already said, I've got a spare bedroom. If we need to put someone in our bedroom, we're willing to do that. And so God's just been so gracious in doing that. And it's really exciting to see that next generation give consideration to what God is doing within their own lives. So that's my plug for Faith. Let me share just a little bit of my concerns now, all right? And that's going to frame our time in the Word. So our time in the Word is actually going to be in Matthew 10. So if you want to turn there, go ahead and turn to Matthew 10. And I chose this particular passage in light of both the theme of the weekend as it relates to missions next door, because Matthew 10 is speaking in terms, and we'll look at it in just a moment here, where Christ is not speaking about overseas missions. As a matter of fact, he's very, very specific. And the outset of the passage, this is the commissioning of both the 12 and probably larger groups. And again, I'll just frame it so we understand it. He sends them out beginning in verse 5, and he says, these 12 Jesus sent out instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans. And so he's being very restrictive in the nature of the mission from a geographical perspective. And then he's moving from the negative to the positive, verse 6, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and proclaim as you go, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Again, our goal this morning is not to open up the whole theology of kingdom of heaven in Matthew, nor necessarily the Jewish nature of Christ's ministry. All I want us to see is that this passage is targeting individuals that are going to use terminology within an American context, that they're going to their neighbors. If they're not going over there, they're going next door. So that's the framework for this. Now, with that in mind, we're going to look specifically not at the totality of Christ's instructions. What I want to look at is his concern as it relates to the instructions. Because he gives them a number of instructions, but he's seeing something in the eyes of his disciples, and he's addressing the heart issue. Right? Before we talk about the specific heart issue that he's addressing, I want to address this both from an international perspective and then also from a local perspective. All right, 10 countries that have the fewest number of full-time Christian workers per million in population. As I read the countries, I want you to think. Right? I want you to evaluate your own reactions for a moment. Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, North Africa, that's a conglomeration of countries, obviously, Iran, Uzbekistan, Somalia, Tajikistan, Yemen, Turkey. And most of those countries are in what missiologists call the 1040 window. All right, so you have 40 degrees north of the equator, or 10 degrees north of the equator up to 40 degrees north of the equator, roughly from the West Africa going through Indonesia. So most of the countries are within that geographical vicinity. And again, most missiologists would say that is where the majority of unreached people group are. I'm very hesitant in that terminology because is fairly elastic in how you define an unreached people group, but generally speaking, it's an individual or say people group in which less than 2% of them have any access to the gospel. My hesitation, even in the terminology, is that when you use terminology of unreached people group, it suggests that then everyone else is reached. All right, and that's what I'm very hesitant about, because there are needs everywhere. So that terminology is only locating those who have the least amount of access to the gospel. Okay, now when I read the names of those countries, what's your natural internal response? Let me rephrase it this way. How many of you would like to live in one of those countries? Pardon?
They're kind of like a totalitarian.
Good. All right, so the majority of them Islamic in nature. The majority of them have a dictatorial or totalitarian government. All right, the majority of them, freedom of religion is unthinkable. The majority of them, access to them is not going to take place via traditional missions. The majority of them would not be locations that you're going to go to Realtor.com and hope to move to within the course of the next 6 months. The majority of them are not locations where you want your children to live. Again, being, if I can phrase it this way, in ministry specifically, helping individuals get to the field. I just left a missions conference last week, and we had roughly 75 different agencies or missionaries that were there, and we had a long discussion last Wednesday night about what's defined as the generational gap. And the generational gap is simply this, is that there are far more missionaries that are leaving the field than that are going to the field. Right, the number that are retiring versus the number that are being recruited, it's just the gap is widening, and it's a growing concern. And the question that was asked of me, because I've worked with the college students, and I've worked with seminary students, and the question is why? Why is it that individuals are not giving thought to the field? All right, let me give you, and again, I'm going to shoot a shot here. My goal isn't to aim toward anyone unless the Lord lands the cannonball per se. But across the board, this is what is there's an agreed upon reality here. An agreed upon reality is that parents and churches are not modeling evangelism as a way of life. And they're discouraging missions and ministry as a life vocation. I can't even begin to tell you the number of parents that have been in my office that have said, Brian, I know that my child came to talk to you about maybe switching their majors to missions, and I want you to know I've told them absolutely not. I've had phone calls from parents saying, no, I don't want you to talk to my child anymore. It's off limits. I do not want my child to give thought to any one of these 10 countries, much less any place else. I don't want my grandkids living up there. Yes, we're all for missions. All right, that's why we give. But don't talk about going. All right, and don't talk to my child. Someone else's child can do that. But we're going to hold. We're going to grasp. We're not going to release. All right, it is real. There is a fear factor as it relates to what is happening in the world. There's a fear factor as it relates to what's happening in the United States. And that fear factor has paralyzed individuals to the extent where Great Commission living is not a consideration for many. All right, so why is there the gap in recruitment versus retirement? One is just that generational gap. Second, I simply say is there's a strategic gap, and that in many of those countries, traditional missions just won't work. You just can't go there on a missionary visa. And so there has to be a more creative thinking as it relates to how to get there. Now, the end result of missions must be the same because it's biblical. The end result is the establishment of a local church. But the way that one goes about it, I think, is probably going to follow a little bit more of the old Moravian context, where they sent individuals who had craftsman skills. They sent educators. And then they sent individuals that were gifted in the Word, and they sent them in teams. All right, so the way that the point of entry is different. And then I would say finally is that there's a sustainability, or what I would define as a suffering gap. Life in many of those countries is difficult. Education for your children doesn't come easy. Personal friendships don't exist. Local churches are non-existent. Political pressure is always there. And in broad terms, our theology of suffering is shallow. Because our theology of suffering is shallow, the thought of actually going to another country and suffering, that's difficult. At times it's unbearable. Again, what I'm going to say, I say it with a smile on my face. I don't say it pejoratively, because I love working with college students. But for a college student, 2 hours where the internet is down, that's suffering. All right, that's getting to the point of, all right, when are we going to get this fixed? Because I can't go without it. I think as churches we have a responsibility, and as parents, I want to make sure I put the responsibility where it lies. I think as parents we have a responsibility of teaching our children how to suffer. All right, that doesn't mean, putting them out in the cold in Minnesota. That's an internal character that allows them to prioritize what's important versus those things that are secondary and tertiary. Right, that's character training, where they learn to live without, they learn to take up their cross, because that's the Christ life. All right, and that is part of what it means. And you can't sustain overseas, and you can't even, and we'll get to the local in a moment here, you can't even sustain locally for the gospel if you're not willing to suffer. All right, let's go back to Matthew. Matthew's preparing his disciples to go overseas, and again, he gives them a series of instructions, including the realities of persecution, picking it up in 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpent and innocent as doves. All right, so he's acknowledging that suffering is coming. There's a whole section here as it speaks about suffering. Sometimes, again, we think that the disciples are 40 and 50-year-old grizzled fishermen. I don't think that's the case. I think some of them probably were in their teens, maybe early 20s. These are young men that are going out, and as they're hearing these instructions, Christ is looking in their eyes, and there is this fear factor that is growing in their eyes, and the same fear factor that you would have growing in your heart as you think about sending a child into one of these countries. So how does Christ respond to that? Well, he responds to it, picking it up in verse 24. It says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. If they've called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household? All right, so he's setting a theological foundation there that we'll come back and we'll look at. Then he makes it really practical. And in essence, what he's doing here is he's going to speak right into the disciples' lives, and he's going to say it 3 times lest they miss it. All right, so let me read the passage, and you'll see the repetition. Verse 26, so have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, for you are of more value than many sparrows. All right, just for sake of time, I'll stop reading there. Do you see the repetition? Right, there's 3 commands that are given. It's the same command, but it's given 3 different times. And we see it in verse 26, we see it in verse 28, we see it in verse 31. Christ has just commissioned to the disciples to go to their neighbors, all right, to go to the surrounding houses within Israel. To go to the most friendly, if I can phrase it this way from a Jewish perspective, the most friendly of audiences. You don't have to go to the Gentiles, you don't have to go to the Samaritans, just stay within your communities. And you're still going to get persecuted. You're still a sheep going out to wolves. And do not fear. By the way, do not fear. 3rd time, do not fear. I think Christ's message to the disciples is just speaking to the reality of the human heart. It is so interesting that when we speak about going and talking to individuals, if we were talking about, Vikings versus the Packers, that's a pretty easy conversation to have. Or if we were talking about something that we enjoy, do you notice how those conversations can be had with absolutely no shuddering of the heart? No shaking of the hand, no dryness of the throat. But the minute you start engaging someone in a gospel conversation, there's this instantaneous recognition that you're going into an area that has risk. And the whole mindset changes. And Christ knows that. All right, so let's just walk through the passage. And what I'd like you to do is think through. I think what Christ does here is he provides 4 foundations for us on how to overcome fear. Right, to put it more positively, what Christ wants us to do, and what he wanted his disciples to do in this context, is he wants them to speak courageously. He wants them to communicate the truth of the Scriptures clearly and openly for all to hear. Right, what is he concerned about? What he's concerned about is actually verse 27. Right, this is the content of the communication. He says, what I tell you in the dark, say in the light. And what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetop. So if we ask the question, if the goal here is for Christ to give us courage, what is it courage to do? It's courage to speak openly and clearly and publicly. That's what the courage is. You are what you have heard quietly. And in this context, from the words of Christ, as far as the disciples, in our context, what we know by way of the truths of the gospel, what we talk about within the confines of this building, right, those things, Christ says, you need to speak them openly, courageously, and publicly. Proclaim them not from the basement, but proclaim them from the rooftop. Right, and in the midst of that, there's going to be fear. So what is it that's going to fuel this courage to speak in that way? Both with our neighbors, with our co-workers, and then ultimately, as we model that within our lives, our children will recognize that evangelism as a way of life works. that the gospel indeed works, and that this is the normal Christian life, not the abnormal. The normal Christian life is to proclaim openly, publicly, clearly. And when our children see that, I think that they will be much more open-handed as it results to perhaps location where that takes place. All right, quickly. What are the 4 reasons? I think the first reason he gives is in verse 25. And he simply says this: have no fear to speak, because your mistreatment identifies you with Christ. I have no fear to speak because your mistreatment identifies you with Christ. And again, we know the passage. Let me just reread verse 25. It is enough for the disciples to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. If they've called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign? Again, that's the expectation, malign. How much more will they malign those of his household? Again, what we find at the beginning of verse 26 is the word so there, or the word therefore. All right, so have no fear has a foundation, it has a base. And the therefore points us back to the base, to the foundation. Why can we have no fear? Well, we have no fear because our mistreatment identifies us with our master. It's an understood reality. In essence, what Christ is saying is this, is your mistreatment for speaking the truth clearly and openly is not some unexpected, accidental, random, meaningless experience. That's just the way that they treated me. So if they treat you like that, that's actually an indicator, that's a sign that you are of my household. Therefore, don't be afraid when they call you names. Don't be afraid when they seek to make fun of you. Don't be afraid when they call you a bigot and a believer, because that's what they called me. And so you're identifying with me in that process. And as I said earlier, I think this is basic discipleship. When one goes through the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 13, for consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that, right? Consider what Christ went through as the foundation for what? So that you do not grow weary and lose heart. Consider what Christ did and allow that to be the foundation for your actions. I think 1 Peter, the entire book is given over to a theology of suffering. It's mentioned more, suffering is mentioned more in 1 Peter than any other New Testament epistle. And I think the foundational verse is actually in chapter 1, verse 21. It says, for you are called for the purpose. All right, what's that purpose? Righteous suffering. Since Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example that you may follow in his steps. And again, as we go through 1 Peter often, and in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, he says, beloved, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeal that's upon you. Don't be surprised by this. So when we speak openly and courageously, we can anticipate a negative response, because the message of the gospel has an exclusivity to it that is absolutely contrary to a postmodern pluralistic world in which we live. We all know. If Christianity, the response of many individuals is something like this: hey, if Christianity works for you, fantastic. Glad it's working for you. Just don't talk to me about it. And don't tell me it's the only way. That's bigoted. That's arrogant. But if it's working for you, great, fine. Just lock it in a box, put it in your home, and keep it there. All right. And Christ is simply saying that's not normal, expected Christianity. You have to speak. And when you speak, you will be mistreated. And that mistreatment is actually part of your identity with me. A second reason that he gives is simply this. It's found in verse 26. He says, so have no fear of them. All right, and then there's a for. All right, so that's building on this concept of having no fear. For, nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be made known. And so the first reason is simply this: have no fear because your mistreatment identifies you with Christ. The second reason is have no fear to speak because you are on the victorious side. You're on the winning side. Right? At the end of the day, the message of truth will be declared as truthful, and sin and vice will be exposed as evil. All right, now the question is how does that actually help you overcome? And the way I would phrase it, and I'll put it in an illustration format. I travel a lot, and since I travel a lot, I really enjoy sports. At times I actually have to fast from it because I can watch two people play about anything. I'll choose a side, and I enjoy that competitive nature. There are particular teams that I grew up close to, so I will cheer for. I actually grew up 5 minutes from Ohio Stadium, and so I'm an Ohio State Buckeye fan. All right, don't stone me for that, but I get it by geography at that stage. We all know that Ohio State and Michigan is a fairly intense rivalry. And so if you were to go to, I'll say, the Big House, Michigan Stadium, to watch an Ohio State-Michigan game, if you wear an Ohio State jersey, you're taking your life in your hands. All right? Being maligned, all right? That's an expected reality when you wear an Ohio State jersey on the campus of the University of Michigan. So if I were to go to a game like that, what I would do is this. I would have a black leather jacket. And I would be wearing my black leather jacket, and I'd be watching the game. And if at the end of the first quarter, Ohio State is up by, let's say, 2 touchdowns, I might take my jacket off and have my Ohio State jersey on. And then they can see my Ohio State jersey. And then at the end of the half, if we're up by maybe 3 touchdowns, then I actually might take my jersey off, and I might actually have some statement on a T-shirt that speaks about Ohio's superiority over the entire state of Michigan. And if by the end of the third quarter we're up by 4 or 5 touchdowns, then I actually may take that T-shirt off and show them that I have a big O painted on my chest, and be willing to say, I'm identifying at that point. All right. Cognitive faith says, wear the black jacket over everything. Yes, you know that you're on the winning team, but don't act on that until your faith is made sight. Right? Active faith says you go to the game as if you've already won. Right? You go to the game, and to use the analogy, they see the big red O. Right? From a believing perspective, we're told, biblically, we've already won. We don't have to hide anything. We don't have to cover our faith. And I think that's exactly what Christ is saying here. He's saying, listen, there will come a day when everything will be made manifest, when righteousness will be made manifest, when vice and evil will be made manifest, and when you speak of me as the Messiah, in this particular context, when we speak of Christ as the exclusive way of salvation, you can proclaim that openly with the absolute confidence that you are on the winning team. And it doesn't matter what anyone else in the stadium says. Because when the score is final, right, what you are saying will be validated as truthful. Thus, it must be proclaimed. So have courage. Have courage. Right, third thing he says is simply this: have no fear to speak. And if this isn't encouraging, I'm not sure what is. Verse 28, and do not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So here you go. Have no fear to speak, because they can only kill you. Doesn't that just encourage you this morning? You go, hey! All you can do is kill me. Now again, most of us, when we hear that, we go, well, Lord, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the most encouraging and motivating thing I want to hear. But what Christ does is this. Right? By taking out the risk of eternity, He allows us to live with the freedom of risk in this life. There is no risk in this life if our eternity is secure. And I think that's exactly what Christ is doing. He's saying, don't fear the individual that can only snatch out this short parcel of a human life when you have absolute confidence of where your eternity is going to be spent at that point. So don't fear that at all. Again, and there's so many individuals that have modeled this from a missions perspective, and I could share multiple illustrations. I'll go to my favorite one. John Peyton, who was a missionary to the New Hebrides Islands back in the 1800s, when this whole question came up of risking your life, he was meeting with his church board. And one of the men on his church board, his name was Mr. Dixon, as Peyton was sharing that he was thinking about going to the islands, Dixon responded by saying, "The cannibals! You will be eaten by the cannibals!" I mean, if you go to the New Hebrides, and this had already happened to other missionaries. They'd been eaten by the cannibals. And I appreciate Mr. Dixon's concern for poor John. And you're going to go there, and you're going to land, and boom, it's going to be over. And I love Peyton's response. He said this, "Mr. Dixon, you are advanced in years now, and your prospect is soon to be laid in the grave. And there you will be eaten by worms. I confess to you that if I can but live and die serving and honoring the Lord Jesus Christ, it makes no difference to me whether I am eaten by cannibals or by worms. And at the great day, my resurrection body will rise as fair as yours in the likeness of our risen Redeemer." That's a guy who understood that he didn't have to have fear, because all they can do is take your life at that point. Final reason, and we'll just go through the passage obviously quickly. Verses 30 and 31, he says this. He says, "But even the hairs of your head are numbered." And earlier he speaks about his care for the sparrows in verse 29. Verse 31, "Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows." Fourth reason is simply this: have no fear to speak, because God pays intimate care for you. Have no fear to speak, because God pays intimate care for you. When you go to your neighbor, when you go to your coworker, when you go to family members, and the dryness of the throat is there, and someone asked me the other day, do I get scared when I fear the gospel? And the assumption was this: Brian, you've been doing this for 35 years. I'm sure the gospel just flows out of you just as easy as can be, like sweat when you're running. No. There are some of you that God has just instinctively given a boldness of spirit and a boldness of life where it just, boom, it just flows from you so naturally. And my response to you is, man, God bless. I wish I were like you. It's not me. I still get nervous. I still feel, when I talk about the dryness of the throat, I still get it. I do. I am still more prone to silent denial. When I sit down on a plane and I have the opportunity to talk to the person beside me, when I know that right now talking to the person beside you isn't the most encouraged thing in the world on planes, I still go, maybe if I wait long enough they'll put headsets on, and then I'll be free of that responsibility. No, that's when I have to stop and remind myself of these truths. I have to stop and say, no, God cares for me. He cares for the hair on my head. He cares for the sparrows that fall. And it doesn't matter what the person beside me, it doesn't matter what my family member, it doesn't matter what my coworker, it doesn't matter what my neighbor thinks. I will speak the gospel openly, plainly, and boldly. I must. And God will care for me. And I'll trust in that. All right, so this is a fun passage. And the reason it's an enjoyable passage is because I can see myself as one of the disciples having those big eyes going, you really want me to go proclaim openly everything that you told me, Christ? Are you serious? Christ, you got to be, do you know what this is going to cost me? And Christ in his love looks at him and says, I know what you're thinking. All right, have courage. Don't fear. Don't fear. Don't fear. Don't fear to speak. Don't fear to release your children. Don't fear to go. Because of these reasons. All right, hopefully that's an encouragement for you, even as we walk through the passage, and also some food for thought as we think about the next generation of Christian global workers. Why don't we pray? Lord, thanks for the encouragement of the passage. Lord, thanks for the disciples that actually did exactly what you told them to do. They went out, and by church history, they gave their lives for the sake of the gospel. And we would pray that we would follow in their steps simply because they followed in your steps. And we seek to be identified with you. And we'll give you thanks in your name. Amen.